I'm Hattie, 54 years old, and I thought I knew my son. For 20 years, I raised Marcus by myself after his father walked out on us. I worked double shifts as a teacher, sold my grandmother's house to pay for his college tuition, and never once complained about the sacrifices. I believed that love and dedication would be enough to keep our family bond strong. But sometimes the people closest to us can shock us in ways we never imagined possible. When Marcus told me I couldn't attend his wedding and then sent me a bill for $90,000, I realized I had been living in a fantasy. Before I tell you what happened next, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Please hit that like button and subscribe, because this story will show you how sometimes the people closest to us can surprise us in the most shocking ways. Looking back now, I can see the warning signs were there all along. But love has a way of making us blind to uncomfortable truths. When Marcus was 8 years old and Robert packed his bags without a backward glance, I promised my little boy that we would be okay together. I meant every word of that promise, even when it cost me everything I had. Those early years were a constant juggling act between my teaching job at Lincoln Elementary and evening shifts at the local diner. While other single mothers struggled to make ends meet, I was determined that Marcus would never feel like he was missing out on anything because his father had abandoned us. I attended every school play, every soccer game, every parent-teacher conference with a smile on my face, even when exhaustion weighed down my shoulders like a heavy coat. The real sacrifice came when Marcus graduated high school with excellent grades and dreams of attending UC Berkeley. The tuition was steep, nearly $45,000 a year, but I had been preparing for this moment since the day Robert left. My grandmother had left me her beautiful Victorian house in the historic district of Sacramento, a place filled with childhood memories and family history stretching back 4 generations. Without hesitation, I put it on the market. The house sold for $180,000, every penny of which went toward Marcus's education. I moved into a small 2-bedroom apartment on the other side of town, trading hardwood floors and stained glass windows for beige carpet and fluorescent lighting. When friends questioned my decision, I simply told them that investing in my son's future was worth more than any house could ever be. During those college years, Marcus would call me every Sunday evening to share stories about his classes, his friends, and his dreams of becoming a financial advisor. I cherished those conversations, feeling proud that despite our struggles, I had raised a young man with ambition and character. He graduated summa cum laude with a degree in economics, and I cried tears of joy at his commencement ceremony, knowing that every sacrifice had been worthwhile. Everything began to change during Marcus's final semester when he met Priscilla Whitmore at a campus networking event. She was everything. I wasn't polished, sophisticated, and born into the kind of wealth that most people only see in movies. Her father owned Whitmore and Associates, one of the most prestigious accounting firms in Northern California, with offices overlooking San Francisco Bay and clients whose names appeared regularly in Fortune magazine. The first time Marcus brought Priscilla to visit our modest apartment, I noticed how her eyes swept across our simple furnishings with barely concealed disdain. She smiled politely when I served homemade lasagna on my everyday dishes, but I caught her photographing her plate with the expression that suggested she was documenting something amusing for her friends. When I asked about her family, she spoke in measured tones about country club memberships, European vacations, and charity galas that cost more than my annual salary. After that visit, Marcus's Sunday phone calls became less frequent and considerably shorter. When I asked about Priscilla, he would describe her accomplishments with an enthusiasm that felt forced, as if he was trying to convince himself as much as me. She worked in marketing for her father's company, lived in a downtown San Francisco loft that cost $8,000 a month, and drove a BMW that was newer than any car I had ever owned. The first real crack in our relationship appeared 6 months into Marcus and Priscilla's courtship, though I was too hopeful to recognize it as the beginning of the end. Marcus called on a Tuesday evening in March, his voice carrying an excitement I hadn't heard since his college graduation day. "Mom, I have incredible news," he said, and I could practically hear him smiling through the phone. Priscilla and I are engaged. I proposed last weekend during a trip to Carmel and she said yes. My heart soared with happiness for my son, even as a small voice in the back of my mind whispered warnings I wasn't ready to acknowledge. Oh, Marcus, that's wonderful news. I'm so happy for both of you. When do I get to see the ring? When are you planning the wedding? There was a pause that lasted just a beat too long before he answered. Well, actually, we're having an engagement party this Saturday at Priscilla's parents' house in Marin County. It's going to be pretty small, though. Just immediate family and a few close friends. You understand how these things work with space limitations and everything. I understood perfectly. I understood that I wasn't considered immediate family in Priscilla's world, despite being the woman who had raised the groom-to-be single-handedly for 20 years. I understood that my presence would somehow diminish the sophisticated atmosphere they were trying to create. But instead of voicing these thoughts, I swallowed my hurt and congratulated him again. Of course, sweetheart. I'm sure it will be lovely. Maybe we can celebrate together soon, just the three of us. Absolutely, Mum. We'll definitely plan something special for you. The weekend came and went without any photos or updates from the engagement celebration. I spent Saturday evening looking at Priscilla's Instagram account, scrolling through pictures of crystal champagne flutes, elaborate flower arrangements, and guests wearing clothes that probably cost more than my monthly rent. In one photo, I spotted Marcus's father, Robert, looking distinguished in a navy blazer and holding a glass of what appeared to be expensive wine. The man who had walked out on his son 20 years ago had somehow earned an invitation to celebrate Marcus's engagement while I sat alone in my apartment with a cup of tea and a heavy heart. When Marcus finally called the following Tuesday, he sounded different. His voice carried a new formality that made me feel like I was talking to a stranger rather than the boy I had raised. He described the party in glowing terms, mentioning the professionally catered dinner, the live jazz trio, and the 24 guests who had toasted their future together. He never once acknowledged that I had been excluded, and I lacked the courage to bring up the obvious hurt I was feeling. Priscilla's mother has some wonderful ideas for the wedding, he continued. They're thinking about a destination ceremony, somewhere really special that reflects their vision for their life together. Their vision. Their life together. The pronouns felt like tiny daggers, emphasizing how completely I had been written out of this new chapter in my son's story. When I tentatively asked about timing and location, hoping I might still have a role to play in the actual wedding, Marcus became vague and promised to keep me updated as plans developed. That night, I lay awake wondering when exactly I had become an outsider in my own son's life, and whether the distance between us was something that could ever be bridged again. Spring turned to summer, and with it came the phone call that would shatter what remained of my illusions about my place in Marcus's new life. It was a Thursday morning in early June, and I was watering the small herb garden I kept on my apartment balcony when my phone rang with Marcus's distinctive ringtone. "Hi, Mom," he said, and I could hear traffic in the background, suggesting he was calling during his lunch break. "I wanted to let you know that we've set the date. Priscilla and I are getting married on June 26th at the Auberge du Soleil in Napa Valley. It's going to be absolutely beautiful." I nearly dropped my watering can in excitement. Finally, after months of vague promises and distant politeness, I was going to be included in my son's wedding day. I immediately began making mental lists of everything I would need to do: find the perfect mother-of-the-groom dress, arrange time off from my part-time tutoring job, maybe even splurge on a weekend at the resort so I could be there for any pre-wedding festivities. "That's wonderful, Marcus. I'm so excited. Should I book a room at the resort? I know it's probably expensive, but I want to be there for everything." "Well, actually, Mom, that's something we need to discuss. Why don't you come over this weekend? Priscilla will be here, and we can all talk about the arrangements together." Something in his tone made my stomach clench with apprehension, but I pushed the feeling aside. Maybe they wanted my input on flowers or music. Maybe Priscilla was finally ready to include me in their planning process. I spent the next 3 days shopping for the perfect outfit for our family meeting, eventually settling on a soft blue blouse and navy slacks that made me feel confident and put together. Saturday afternoon found me standing outside Marcus's downtown apartment building, clutching a bottle of wine, and trying to calm my nerves. The building was one of those modern high-rises with floor-to-ceiling windows and a concierge desk in the lobby, the kind of place that screamed expensive rent and exclusive living. When Marcus answered the door, he looked uncomfortable in a way that immediately set me on edge. "Hi, Mom, come on in. Priscilla's just finishing up a work call." The apartment was immaculate in that cold, magazine-perfect way that suggested professional interior design rather than personal touches. Everything was white and chrome and glass, beautiful, but utterly without warmth. Priscilla emerged from the bedroom, wearing white jeans and a silk blouse that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget, her smile bright and sharp as a blade. "Mrs. Johnson, how lovely to see you again," she said, accepting the wine with the kind of gracious politeness that somehow managed to feel insulting. "Marcus and I are so excited to share our wedding plans with you." We settled in the living room, me on the pristine white sofa and them across from me in matching armchairs, creating a setup that felt more like a business meeting than a family discussion. Marcus kept glancing at Priscilla as if waiting for permission to speak, while she maintained that unnaturally bright smile throughout our entire conversation. "Mom," Marcus began, his voice strained with obvious discomfort. "This is really hard for me to say, but Priscilla's family has some concerns about the wedding guest list." "Concerns," I repeated, my heart already sinking toward my shoes. "It's not personal," Priscilla interjected smoothly. "It's just that we're trying to maintain a very specific atmosphere for our special day. Very intimate, very exclusive. My father's business associates will be there, along with some important family friends, and we need everything to be absolutely perfect." The words hung in the air, like smoke from a fire I couldn't yet see but could definitely smell. Marcus was staring at his hands, unable to meet my eyes, while Priscilla continued to smile, with the confidence of someone who had never been denied anything she wanted in her entire privileged life. "What exactly are you trying to tell me?" I asked, though some part of me already knew the answer and was recoiling from it. "We think it would be better if you didn't come to the wedding," Marcus said in a rush, as if saying it quickly would somehow make it hurt less. "It's not about you, Mom. It's about fitting in with their expectations and making sure everything goes smoothly." The words hit me like a physical blow, knocking the breath from my lungs and leaving me speechless. For a moment, I could only stare at my son, this young man I had sacrificed everything to raise, as he sat there telling me I wasn't good enough to attend his wedding. The silence that followed Marcus's announcement stretched on for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. I sat there on their expensive white sofa, my mind struggling to process what I had just heard, while Priscilla maintained her plastic smile and Marcus continued to study his hands as if they contained the secrets of the universe. "What do you mean I can't come?" I finally managed to say, my voice sounding strange and distant to my own ears. "I'm your mother, Marcus. I raised you by myself for 20 years. I know, Mom, and we're so grateful for everything you've done," Marcus said, finally looking up at me with eyes that seemed to plead for understanding. "But this is Priscilla's day too, and her family has certain expectations about how everything should look." "How everything should look," I repeated, feeling anger beginning to rise through the shock and hurt. "What exactly is wrong with how I look?" Priscilla leaned forward slightly, her smile never wavering, but somehow becoming even more condescending. "It's not about appearances, Mrs. Johnson. It's about the overall atmosphere we're trying to create. This is a very exclusive venue with a very particular clientele, and we need to make sure everyone fits seamlessly into that environment." "My own mother fits seamlessly into any environment," I said, my voice rising, despite my efforts to remain calm. "She's a retired teacher who raised her son to have values and character, not someone to be ashamed of." "Nobody's ashamed of anyone," Marcus said quickly, though his inability to maintain eye contact suggested otherwise. "It's just that there are guest list limitations and dress code concerns and venue restrictions that we have to work within." I looked at my son, this young man whose diapers I had changed and whose tears I had dried and whose college tuition I had paid with my grandmother's house, and realized I was listening to carefully rehearsed excuses rather than genuine explanations. These weren't logistical concerns. They were elaborate justifications for a decision that had already been made without any consideration for my feelings. "I saw the pictures from your engagement party," I said quietly. "Robert was there. Your father, who abandoned you when you were 8 years old, was somehow able to fit seamlessly into Priscilla's exclusive atmosphere, but your mother, who raised you single-handedly, is not." Priscilla's smile finally faltered for just a moment, while Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Dad helped pay for the music," he said defensively. "He wanted to contribute something meaningful to our celebration." The irony was almost laughable. The man who had contributed nothing to Marcus's upbringing, but had recently come into money through a successful business venture, was welcome at both the engagement party and the wedding, while I, who had given up everything for my son's future, was being politely disinvited from the most important day of his life. "So this is really about money," I said, the pieces finally clicking into place. "This is about having guests who can contribute financially rather than emotionally." "That's not fair, Mom," Marcus protested. "This is about starting our marriage in the right way, with the right people around us to support our future." "The right people," I repeated, tasting the bitterness of those words. And apparently, I'm not one of them. I stood up from the sofa, my legs feeling shaky, but my resolve growing stronger with each passing second. "I need to go," I said, reaching for my purse. "I need to think about what you've just told me." "Mom, please don't leave like this," Marcus said finally, showing some genuine emotion. "We'll make it up to you, I promise. Maybe we can have a special dinner after the honeymoon, just the three of us." I paused at the door and turned back to look at my son one more time. "You know what, Marcus? I spent 20 years believing that love and sacrifice would be enough to keep our family together. I was wrong. Apparently what really matters is having enough money to buy your way into the right social circles." I walked out of that apartment and down to my car, where I sat in the parking garage and cried until I had no tears left. The little boy who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms and tell me I was the best mother in the whole world had grown up to be a man who was ashamed to have me at his wedding. The day of Marcus's wedding arrived with the kind of golden California sunshine that makes everything look like a postcard, mocking the darkness that had settled over my heart. I spent the morning in my small apartment, moving aimlessly from room to room, like a ghost haunting her own life, while 200 miles away, my son was getting married without me. By afternoon, I had given up all pretense of keeping myself distracted and was sitting on my couch with my laptop obsessively refreshing social media feeds for any glimpse of the celebration I had been excluded from. The first photos began appearing on Instagram around 3 o'clock, posted by guests who clearly had no idea that the groom's mother had been deliberately uninvited to the festivities. The images were everything I had expected, and more the Auberge du Soleil, looking like something from a fairy tale, with sweeping views of the Napa Valley and elaborate floral arrangements that probably cost more than my monthly rent. Priscilla looked stunning in a designer gown that flowed like water, while Marcus wore a custom tuxedo that transformed him into someone I barely recognized. But it was the photo of the wedding party that truly broke my heart. There was Marcus beaming with joy as he stood surrounded by Priscilla's brothers and his college friends, looking happier than I had ever seen him. And there, standing proudly beside the groomsmen, was Robert, wearing an expensive suit and a satisfied smile that suggested he felt perfectly at home in this world of privilege and exclusivity. My ex-husband, who had walked out on his 8-year-old son and disappeared for 20 years, had somehow earned a place of honor at Marcus's wedding. The man who had never attended a single school play or soccer game, who had never helped with homework or wiped away tears, was there to witness our son's most important moment, while I sat alone in my apartment, scrolling through other people's photos like a stranger. The cruelty of it was breathtaking. Not only had I been excluded from the wedding, but my absence had been filled by the very person whose abandonment had shaped so much of Marcus's childhood. It was as if my 20 years of single parenthood had been erased and rewritten, with Robert cast as the acceptable father figure and me relegated to the role of an embarrassing relative who couldn't be trusted to behave appropriately in polite society. As the evening wore on, more photos appeared, the reception with its live band and professional lighting guests dancing on a terrace overlooking the valley. Marcus and Priscilla, cutting a towering cake that looked like a work of art. Every image felt like a knife to my heart, confirming that my absence had not put a damper on the celebration in any way. The wedding had proceeded flawlessly without me, as if I had never existed at all. A week later, a postcard arrived in my mailbox featuring a pristine beach scene from the Maldives. On the back, in Marcus's familiar handwriting, were the words, "Having wonderful time. Thanks for understanding, Mum. Love, Marcus and Priscilla." The casual cheerfulness of the message, as if my exclusion from his wedding was just a minor inconvenience I had graciously accommodated, added insult to injury. I stared at that postcard for a long time, trying to reconcile the loving son I had raised with the callous young man who could send such a thoughtless message after causing me such profound hurt. The Marcus I knew would never have been so carelessly cruel, which meant that either I had failed completely as a mother, or my son had been so thoroughly corrupted by his new family's values that he was no longer recognizable as the person I had raised. Neither possibility offered much comfort, as I faced the reality that my relationship with my only child might be damaged beyond repair. But I had no idea that the worst was yet to come, arriving in my mailbox exactly 1 month after the wedding, in the form of an envelope that would push me from heartbreak into a fury I had never experienced before. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday morning in late July, delivered by regular mail, with no indication that it contained something that would fundamentally change the trajectory of my life. It was thick and cream-colored, with Whitmore and Associates, embossed in gold lettering across the top left corner, and my name and address written in elegant script across the center. For a moment, I allowed myself to hope that it might be a belated wedding. Thank you note, perhaps an acknowledgement from Priscilla's family that they had treated me poorly and wanted to make amends. Maybe Marcus had finally found the courage to stand up to his new in-laws and demand that they show his mother the respect she deserved. I opened the envelope with something approaching optimism, unprepared for the document that would shatter what remained of my faith in my son's character. Inside was a professionally printed invoice on Whitmore and Associates letterhead, itemized with the kind of meticulous detail that suggested this was a legitimate business transaction rather than some kind of elaborate joke. At the top in bold letters were the words, "Wedding and honeymoon expenses, Marcus and Priscilla Whitmore Johnson." My eyes scanned down the list, each line item hitting me like a physical blow. Wedding venue rental, $35,000. Catering and bar service, $28,000. Photography and videography, $8,000. Flowers and decorations, $7,000. Honeymoon accommodation in Maldives, $12,000. At the bottom of the page in larger font that seemed to mock me from the expensive paper was the total $90,000. I read through the invoice 3 times, my brain struggling to process what I was seeing. This had to be some kind of mistake, a document that had been mailed to the wrong address by accident. There was absolutely no universe in which I could be expected to pay for a wedding. I had been forbidden to attend a celebration that had deliberately excluded me, while including the ex-husband who had abandoned our family decades ago. But then I noticed the letter that had been folded behind the invoice, written on matching letterhead and signed with Priscilla's distinctive signature. I unfolded it with trembling hands, somehow knowing that whatever I read would be even worse than the bill itself. "Dear Mrs. Johnson," it began in the same artificially warm tone Priscilla had used during our uncomfortable conversations. "As discussed, you expressed desire to contribute to Marcus and Priscilla's special day. Please find attached the itemized costs for their wedding celebration and honeymoon trip. Payment is due within 30 days of receipt of this invoice." I had to stop reading and take several deep breaths before I could continue, my hands shaking, with a combination of shock and rage that made it difficult to focus on the words. "We understand that this represents a significant investment, but we're confident you'll agree that Marcus and Priscilla deserve the very best as they begin their life together. You should feel grateful to be included in their happiness in this meaningful way. We look forward to receiving your prompt payment so we can close our books on this joyous occasion." The letter was signed, "With warm regards, Priscilla Whitmore Johnson," as if she had just invited me to a garden party rather than demanded that I pay $90,000 for the privilege of being excluded from my son's wedding. I sat at my kitchen table, staring at the documents in front of me, trying to understand how my life had taken such a surreal turn. Not only had I been banned from attending my son's wedding, but I was now being billed for the entire cost of the celebration, as if my exclusion had somehow created a financial obligation rather than relieving me of one. The audacity of it was breathtaking. These people had deliberately humiliated me by excluding me from the most important day of my son's life, and now they expected me to express my gratitude by writing them a check for more money than I had ever seen in one place. It was extortion disguised as an invoice cruelty, dressed up as a business transaction. I tried calling Marcus immediately, but his phone went straight to voicemail. I tried again an hour later, and then again that evening, but apparently my son was too busy enjoying his new life to take calls from the mother, who was now expected to finance it. The next few days passed in a blur of failed phone calls and mounting frustration, as Marcus seemed to have vanished completely from any form of communication. I left voicemails that went unanswered, sent text messages that were ignored, and even tried reaching out through his work email only to receive an automated response saying he was out of the office on extended leave. Finally desperate for answers, I drove to his downtown apartment building only to discover from the concierge that Marcus and Priscilla had moved out the previous week. When I asked for their new address, I was told it was confidential information that couldn't be shared with unauthorized individuals. The idea that I was now considered an unauthorized individual in my own son's life was almost as painful as the original wedding exclusion. It took several phone calls and some creative detective work through mutual acquaintances before I finally learned that Marcus and Priscilla had moved into a guest house on the Whitmore family estate in Marin County. Armed with this information, I made the hour-long drive across the bay, rehearsing what I would say when I finally confronted my son about the outrageous invoice. The Whitmore estate was even more intimidating than I had imagined, a sprawling property behind iron gates with security cameras and a long winding driveway lined with perfectly manicured landscaping. When I pulled up to the main house and rang the doorbell, I was greeted by a uniformed housekeeper who informed me that the family was not receiving visitors and suggested I call to schedule an appointment. "I'm here to see my son," I told her firmly. "Marcus Johnson. He lives in the guest house." The woman looked at me with the kind of polite skepticism reserved for door-to-door salespeople and religious missionaries. "I'll need to check with the family before I can allow anyone onto the property," she said. "What is your name, please?" "I'm Hattie Johnson, Marcus's mother." Her expression shifted slightly, and I caught a flicker of recognition that suggested my name had been mentioned in less than flattering terms. "Please wait here," she said, closing the door and leaving me standing on the front steps like an unwelcome solicitor. 10 minutes later, she returned with an apologetic smile and the news that the family was not available to see me. When I asked specifically about Marcus, she claimed that he and his wife were not currently on the property, though I could see his car parked near what appeared to be a converted carriage house at the back of the estate. Frustrated, but not defeated, I returned to my car and called Marcus's number one more time. To my surprise, he actually answered, though his voice carried a tension that suggested he had been expecting my call and dreading it in equal measure. "Mom, I know why you're calling, and I'm really sorry about the invoice. I didn't know they were going to send it until after it was already in the mail." "You didn't know," I repeated, my voice rising with indignation. "Marcus, this is a bill for $90,000. How could you not know about something like that?" "It's complicated, Mom. Priscilla's family paid for everything up front, and they've been talking about how different family members should contribute since you're my family too. They thought you would want to help with the costs since you weren't able to be there for the actual day." The twisted logic was stunning. Because I had been excluded from the wedding, I was somehow more obligated to pay for it, not less. It was like being charged admission to a movie theater while being banned from entering the building. "Marcus, listen to yourself," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "They deliberately excluded me from your wedding, and now they want me to pay for the privilege of being humiliated. Do you understand how insane that sounds?" I know it seems weird, Mum, but you have to understand their perspective. Other parents contributed to the wedding costs. Even Dad helped pay for the music. They just think it's fair for everyone to share in the expenses. The mention of Robert's contribution was like salt in an open wound. Your father, who abandoned you for 20 years, was invited to your wedding and asked to contribute money. I, who raised you single-handedly and sacrificed everything for your education, was excluded from the ceremony, but expected to pay for it. Can you honestly tell me that seems fair to you? There was a long pause before Marcus answered, and when he spoke, his voice carried a defensive edge that I had never heard before. Look, Mom, I know this situation isn't ideal, but Priscilla's family has invested a lot in our future together. They bought us a house, they're giving me a position at the firm, and they're treating me like a son. The least we can do is show them that we're willing to be part of their world. Their world, I repeated, feeling something cold and hard settling in my chest. And apparently their world doesn't have room for the woman who raised you. That's not what I said, Mum. It's just that things are different now. I have different responsibilities, and I need to think about what's best for my marriage and my career. I sat in my car outside the iron gates of the Whitmore estate, listening to my son explain why his new family's money and social status were more important than the woman who had given up everything to raise him, and I felt something fundamental shift inside me. The hurt and disappointment that had been consuming me for months suddenly crystallized into a cold, clear anger that felt surprisingly empowering. I see, I said quietly. Well, Marcus, let me make something very clear to you. I will not be paying 1 penny of that invoice. Not for a wedding I was forbidden to attend, not to people who have treated me with such deliberate cruelty, and certainly not to support a lifestyle that apparently has no place for the values I tried to teach you. Mom, please don't be like this. It's really not that much money when you think about what it represents. $90,000 is not that much money. I laughed, but there was no humor in it. Marcus, that's more than I make in 2 years. That's more than most people see in their entire lives. And you're sitting there in your mansion talking to me like I'm being unreasonable for refusing to bankrupt myself for people who hate me. Nobody hates you, Mom. They just think you should contribute to our happiness. Well, here's my contribution to your happiness, Marcus. I'm going to teach you and your new family a lesson about respect that apparently no one else has bothered to share with you. I hung up the phone and drove home with a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in months, my mind already working on a plan that would ensure the Whitmore family learned exactly who they were dealing with when they decided to mess with Hattie Johnson. The first thing I did when I got home was create a detailed file documenting every interaction I had had with Marcus and the Whitmore family since the engagement announcement. I printed out screenshots of the social media posts from the wedding, saved copies of every text message and email, and carefully preserved the original invoice and letter in plastic sleeves, like evidence for a criminal trial. Next, I spent several hours researching the Whitmore family and their business, discovering some interesting information that would prove useful in my campaign for justice. It turned out that Whitmore and Associates had been involved in a recent scandal involving aggressive tax avoidance strategies that had attracted the attention of the IRS. Mr. Whitmore had also been investigated for potential conflicts of interest related to his wife's position on the City Planning Commission, though no formal charges had been filed. Armed with this information, I crafted a response that would make it clear to the Whitmore family that they had seriously underestimated the woman they were trying to intimidate. I wrote the letter by hand on my personal stationery, wanting every word to carry the weight of my genuine fury. Dear Whitmore family, I began. I am in receipt of your invoice dated July 20th, requesting payment of $90,000 for wedding and honeymoon expenses related to my son Marcus's marriage to your daughter Priscilla. I find this request both insulting and legally baseless. I continued for 2 full pages, detailing the timeline of my exclusion from the wedding and the cruelty I had experienced at their hands. I made it clear that I had no legal obligation to pay for a celebration I had been forbidden to attend, and that any further attempts to collect this fictional debt would be considered harassment. Furthermore, I wrote in my closing paragraph, I am consulting with legal counsel about potential remedies for the emotional distress and reputational damage I have suffered as a result of your family's deliberate campaign of humiliation. I suggest you reconsider your approach to this matter before I am forced to pursue more formal avenues for redress. I mailed the letter with certified delivery, ensuring that they would know exactly when it arrived and that I would have proof of their receipt. But I wasn't content to simply defend myself. I wanted to go on the offensive and show these people that actions have consequences, even for the wealthy and privileged. My next stop was the offices of the Sacramento Bee, where I had a contact from my teaching days who now worked as a features reporter. I pitched her the story of my experience, framing it as a cautionary tale about how modern weddings had become so commercialized and exclusive that families were being torn apart by social pressures and financial demands. "Mother billed $90,000 for weddings she wasn't invited to," became the headline that ran on the front page of the lifestyle section 2 weeks later, complete with a photo of me holding the infamous invoice and a detailed account of everything that had transpired since Marcus's engagement announcement. The response was immediate and overwhelming. The newspaper's website crashed from the traffic as the story went viral on social media, with thousands of comments from readers expressing outrage at the Whitmore family's behavior and support for my position. Local radio stations picked up the story, and within days I was fielding calls from television producers wanting to interview me about my experience. But the real satisfaction came from watching the impact on the Whitmore family's reputation and business. Negative reviews began appearing on their company's social media pages, with potential clients canceling contracts and demanding explanations for their treatment of a widowed teacher. The local business community, which had always been somewhat suspicious of their aggressive practices, now had a human face to attach to their concerns about the family's character. Marcus called me 3 days after the story broke, his voice tight with panic and barely controlled anger. "Mom, what have you done? Priscilla's family is furious, and they're talking about cutting me off completely. You're ruining my life." "I'm ruining your life," I replied calmly. "Marcus, you banned me from your wedding and then tried to extort $90,000 from me. All I did was tell the truth about what happened. You made us look like monsters in front of the entire city. Priscilla's been crying for 2 days, and her father is talking about firing me from the firm. Well, maybe this will give you some perspective on how it feels to be treated cruelly by people who are supposed to care about you," I said. "Maybe now you'll understand what you put me through when you chose their money over your mother's love. Please, Mom, you have to make this stop. Call the newspaper and tell them you made a mistake. Post something on social media saying it was all a misunderstanding." I took a deep breath, feeling something like peace settle over me for the first time in months. "No, Marcus, I won't be making this stop. You made your choice when you decided I wasn't good enough for your new family. Now you get to live with the consequences of that choice, just like I had to live with the consequences of being excluded from the most important day of your life." "This isn't who you are, Mom. You're not vindictive like this." "You're right," I said quietly. The old Hattie would have quietly paid that invoice and pretended to be grateful for the privilege of being humiliated. But the old Hattie also believed that love and sacrifice would be enough to maintain a relationship with her son. I've learned some hard lessons about standing up for myself, and I have you and your new family to thank for teaching me those lessons. I hung up the phone and returned to my normal routine, confident that I had finally taken control of a situation that had spiraled completely out of my hands. The Whitmore family had underestimated the power of a mother's love turned to righteous fury, and they were about to discover that their money and social status couldn't protect them from the consequences of their own cruelty. The aftermath of my public stand against the Whitmore family unfolded over the following months like a slow-motion earthquake, with reverberations that reached far beyond what I had initially imagined possible. Within 2 weeks of the newspaper story's publication, Whitmore and Associates had lost 3 major corporate clients, citing concerns about the firm's professional judgment and family values in their termination letters. The local business community's response was particularly satisfying, as several prominent families who had previously sought the Whitmore's services for their own financial planning needs, quietly withdrew their accounts and moved their business to competitors. It seemed that in a city where reputation and social standing mattered tremendously, being exposed as the kind of people who would bill their son-in-law's mother for a wedding she wasn't invited to was a bridge too far for many potential clients. Priscilla's mother, who had been so confident in her social superiority during our previous encounters, found herself facing uncomfortable questions at the country club and charity events that formed the backbone of her social calendar. Friends who had once competed for invitations to Whitmore family gatherings now politely declined their events, unwilling to be associated with what the local society pages had begun referring to as the wedding invoice scandal. But perhaps the most gratifying development came 6 months after my story went public, when Marcus appeared at my apartment door on a grey Saturday morning in January, looking haggard and defeated, in a way that immediately told me his fairy tale marriage had hit some serious turbulence. "Hi, Mom," he said quietly, his hands shoved deep in his coat pockets and his eyes unable to meet mine directly. "Can I come in? I think we need to talk." I stepped aside and let him enter, noting how much weight he had lost and how tired he looked compared to the glowing young man in the wedding photos I had seen months earlier. He sat on my familiar old couch, like a stranger visiting someone else's home, his usual confidence replaced by an uncertainty that made him look younger and more vulnerable than he had in years. "Priscilla and I are having some problems," he began, then stopped and shook his head. "Actually, that's not accurate. Our marriage is falling apart, and I'm starting to understand that maybe you were right about some things." I didn't say anything, simply waited for him to find the words he needed to express what had brought him back to the apartment he had once seemed so eager to leave behind. "She's not the person I thought she was, Mom. Or maybe she is exactly who she always was, and I was just too blinded by everything else to see it clearly. The money, the lifestyle, the social status. It all came with strings attached that I didn't understand until it was too late." He told me about the constant criticism he faced from Priscilla and her family about his background, his clothes, his friends, and especially his relationship with me. He described feeling like a project they were trying to improve rather than a person they genuinely cared about, and how his every decision had to be approved by Priscilla's father before he was allowed to proceed. When your story came out in the newspaper, they were furious. Not because they felt guilty about what they had done to you, but because I had failed to control my mother properly. Priscilla actually said that if I was a real man, I would have made you pay that invoice and keep quiet about it. I felt a familiar surge of anger toward the people who had manipulated my son so thoroughly. But I also recognized that Marcus was finally beginning to see the situation clearly for the first time since he had fallen under their influence. "I'm sorry, Mom," he continued, his voice breaking slightly. "I'm sorry I chose their money over your love. I'm sorry I excluded you from my wedding and then asked you to pay for it. I'm sorry I let them convince me that being ashamed of where I came from was somehow a sign of success and sophistication." The apology I had been waiting for finally came, but it felt different than I had expected. Less satisfying and more sad, tinged with the recognition of how much damage had been done to our relationship and how difficult it would be to rebuild the trust that had been shattered. "I don't expect you to forgive me right away," Marcus said. "I know I have a lot of work to do to earn back your respect, but I wanted you to know that I finally understand what I lost when I chose them over you, and I want to find a way to make things right between us if that's possible." I looked at my son, this young man I had raised with so much love and hope, and felt the first stirrings of something that might eventually grow back into the relationship we had once shared. But I also knew that forgiveness would have to be earned rather than simply granted, and that our future relationship would need to be built on mutual respect rather than the unconditional sacrifice I had offered in the past. "Forgiveness is a process, Marcus, not an event," I told him gently. "It's going to take time for us to rebuild what was broken, and it's going to require you to prove through your actions that you've really learned from this experience." Over the following months, Marcus slowly began the work of repairing our relationship while simultaneously extricating himself from his marriage to Priscilla and his entanglement with her family. The divorce was messy and expensive, with the Whitmores attempting to use their financial resources to punish him for what they saw as his betrayal of their investment in his future. But through it all, Marcus demonstrated a strength of character that reminded me of the boy I had raised, the young man who had existed before he was corrupted by wealth and social ambition. He refused their offers of financial settlements in exchange for his silence about their treatment of me, and he publicly acknowledged his mistakes in interviews with local media outlets that were following up on the original story. My mother sacrificed everything to give me opportunities I never would have had otherwise, he said in one particularly moving television interview. She deserved better than what I gave her, and I'm spending every day trying to become worthy of the love she showed me for so many years. 2 years later, as I sit in my small apartment writing this story, Marcus and I have rebuilt a relationship that is different from what we had before, but perhaps stronger in its foundation of mutual respect and honest communication. He has learned that love without respect is just enabling, while I have learned that setting boundaries can actually strengthen relationships rather than damage them. As for that $90,000 invoice that started this whole journey, it taught me the most expensive lesson of my life. Knowing your worth is truly priceless, and sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to be treated badly, even by the people you love most. The Whitmore family eventually moved away from Sacramento, unable to rebuild their reputation in a community where everyone knew the story of how they had treated their son-in-law's mother. Their business never fully recovered from the scandal, and the last I heard, they had relocated to another state where their past mistakes were less well known. I've been asked many times whether I regret taking such a public stand against my son and his former in-laws, whether I think I went too far in my quest for justice and respect. My answer is always the same. I regret that it became necessary, but I don't regret doing what I had to do to reclaim my dignity and teach my son that family relationships must be based on mutual respect rather than one-sided sacrifice. Sometimes the people we love most need to face consequences for their actions before they can understand the true cost of taking our love for granted. In my case, that meant watching my son lose everything he thought he wanted before he could rediscover what actually mattered. It was painful for both of us, but it was also necessary, and I'm grateful that we both learned from the experience before it was too late to rebuild what we had lost. The greatest gift I gave my son wasn't the college tuition I paid by selling my grandmother's house or the years of single parenthood where I sacrificed my own happiness for his future. The greatest gift was teaching him that some things, like dignity, respect, and genuine love, cannot be bought with money, and that relationships built on anything less than mutual respect are destined to crumble under the weight of their own dysfunction. Have you ever found yourself in a situation where you had to choose between keeping the peace and standing up for yourself? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, please give it a like and share it with others who might benefit from hearing about the importance of knowing your worth. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories about life, family, and the sometimes difficult lessons we learn about love and respect. Thank you for listening to my story, and remember that you deserve to be treated with dignity and respect, no matter who you're dealing with. May you always have the courage to stand up for yourself when it matters most.